Welcome everybody. We're at 903 3rd Street, the corner of 3rd and Orange, the old Lemuel North House, here today, August 9th, 2003. And with me is noted Wisconsin historian Dick Larson and homegrown local boy. And the person we want to talk to today is our guest Willis Miller, editor emeritus of the Star Observer, but most noted as the major historian for Hudson. And we're just going to talk to Willis today about Willis.
Great. Willis, how are you? Thank you, Steve, for the use of your
Thank you.
Of your home and your gracious use of libation. For you people who don't know, this is Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola and line of beer. We get this out of the way right away.
Yeah.
Well, Willis, first of all, it's an honor to even sit in your presence, because I kind of have rested at your feet for a long time as a mentor for local history. And the one thing you've taught me more than anything else is we index everything, right? And we do. But I thought it would be a wonderful day for us to just talk about your life and things that you've done. You're now over 40, you can tell the truth. And I thought if we just started off with your life history, start off when you were born, I know in 1918 in Iowa City, Iowa, and then you could just go on from that point and tell us about yourself, and we'll interject a few things here and there and ask you a few questions as time goes on.
We'll add anything you miss.
So your name is, spell that out.
Well, Nick, the first thing I want to say that, of course, I knew your mother. She was my school teacher at Hudson High School, and she was one of my very favorite teachers, and a very good one, too.
Good. It's nice to hear that.
Well, I was born in Iowa City, Iowa, on November 28th, 1918. It was right during the great flu epidemic, and I had the flu the following year in 1919.
Well, did you survive this?
Yes.
Oh, you did.
I survived the flu. And my parents at the time were living in Watertown, South Dakota. And so I spent most of my, up to 2 years old, in Watertown, South Dakota. And my family moved to St. Paul in I think they moved in 1920. And they came to Hudson then in 1922. And we first came here, we lived at a rental of Dr. Lawrence Mayer at the far end of 3rd Street, going to the north, in a big house with 14 rooms, and it was not insulated, and it was the coldest place in town. And the rent was exorbitant, so my father told me, was $25 a month. We lived there for several years, and we moved then to 5th Street. And from that, we went to 3rd Street. And I lived for about 50 years at the corner of 4th and St. Croix, right across from the Catholic Church.
What business was your dad in?
My father was a salesman for Griggs Cooper in St. Paul, and he traveled this area for many years.
And he liked it here?
Yes, oh, my family loved it here.
Yep, I know that. So then you now are 5 years old and starting off in the Hudson school system.
Well, my first teacher was Norma Goldberg, and she was a young married woman, and kindergarten was in the old high school that had been built in 1887, and it was raised in 1924. But it was in the basement, and the students, of course, we came to the kindergarten in the mornings and then went home. And she was my first teacher, and I went all through the public school system, and I graduated from high school in 1936. And while I was in high school, of course, I worked for NYA, the National Youth Administration, on which high school students worked to make some money. And I think we made about $8 a month or some such figure as that. But it was just enough during the Depression to really take off the edges, and you could...
What kind of work was this?
Well, I worked for the superintendent and the office girl he had, or his secretary, and I was a gopher. I go for this and go for that and do that. And I worked there for about 2 years on that.
That's great.
Yes.
And then you graduated then in
36.
1936. And do you have any stories you want to tell us about school?
Well, yes, I have one. The old sanatorium, the Hudson Sanatorium, which was on the end of 7th Street. It had been, the Hudson Sanatorium had been built in 1887 by Dr. Johnson and some other people. And it was the only hospital Hudson had for many, many years. Well, it caught fire in May of 1934. Well, it was right at the noon hour, and most of the high school students were so enthused about the fire, they went to the fire and stayed for the whole afternoon. Of course, the next day there was difficulties when you went back to school. The Professor Rock, who was the principal of the schools, came and gave us all, we were castigated greatly for going to the fire, and we had additional papers to write and other things that weren't so nice.
There were some penalties.
Yes, a lot of penalties. And but to this day, I'm awfully glad I went to the fire, because it's one of the most memorable fires we've ever had. And I've written about it, and I used to go there too. It was really quite a palatial place.
And that overlooked Lake Malibu.
Yes, it overlooked Lake Malibu. At the dedication in 1887, the main speaker of the day was Dr. Cyrus Northrup from the University of Minnesota. I think it's always very interesting.
That was an amazing
And
place.
furthermore, for the affair, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the sage of Boston, wrote an inaugural poem, which was published first in the Star and Times in that year.
Wasn't the hospital dedicated to Holmes?
Yes, it was called.
Named it.
It was called the Oliver Wendell Holmes Hospital. It really it wasn't a full-fledged hospital, but it served the purpose for what they had, and they did have a nursing school to go with it too.
And that was across the tracks, so you had to
Go across the viaduct.
Across the viaduct and to go there, and that was one of the problems, and it's burning, I think, as I recall.
Oh, it was dry and getting
Dry,
up there,
yeah.
and they worried about the fire trucks going across the viaduct.
Whether it would make it or not.
Wobbly.
I remember playing in the rocks in
Yeah.
my youth. Of the leftovers, the
Oh
bricks
yes,
from
the
that.
debris from
Yeah.
that. And it was that way for many, many years.
Yes, it was.
And you couldn't give the property away. I mean, it was so undesirable, supposedly. But now it's one of the choicest
Now
locations in our
overlooking
community.
the lake
Yeah.
and people,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder why we weren't spending money buying some of this stuff.
Yeah,
at
that's
that
right.
time. But foresight has never been my strong point. So then you graduated. Were you working that summer that you graduated? Did you have a job?
Let's see, No, not that job, I don't think.
Okay, then you went on to away to
I went that fall, I entered St. Olaf College.
St. Olaf.
And I was there for 4 years and graduated in 1940. And during my experience at St. Olaf, I worked for the Norwegian American Historical Association that had been founded by Dr. O.E. Rolvag in 1925. And as working in the archives there, I took 2 years of Norwegian, so I'd be able to read the language and to speak it to some extent. And it was really one of the turning points in my life, in that I discovered there the basis for my Hudson area biographical index that I instilled in Hudson from 1940.
And we're going to talk about that in a little
Yes,
while, because that's an amazing tool.
Yes.
In your college years at St. Olaf, I know that somewhere in there you were hitchhiking, because this is during the Depression.
Yes.
Things were
Well,
tough.
in the summer of 1938, I took off and went hitchhiking,
you have a lot of money with you those days?
Well, I had about $10. And I went from Hudson to Chicago, and then from on to Chicago, and I went to New York, and up to Boston, and then back to, I went to Virginia, saw Williamsburg and all. I hitchhiked. And during my time in Boston, I stayed with one of my teachers at St. Olaf, Dr. Agnes Larson, who was the eminent author of the white pine industry in Minnesota. And her sister, whose cottage we stayed in Narragansett Bay, was the first woman professor at Harvard. And she was there. So this one time, when I was there, she said, "Willis, would you like to go to Boston and see Harvard?" And I said, "Yes." So I went and I said, she said, "What do you like to see?" Well, I thought, well, it'd be nice to see the Widener Library. Fine. We went to the Widener Library, and we went there to the library and said, "Well, now we have some things you should do. What do you want to see especially?" "Well, I don't really care. I'm just interested in books and things of this character." And they said, "Well, we'll go to the rare book department." We went to the rare book department, and the caretaker, the archivist, said, "I have something I have to show you." Went back in the bowels of the library, and finally came out with a big bound book, carrying it like this, you know. And she said, "Willis, would you like to hold this?" And I held it. She said, "This is a first folio of Shakespeare." And it was a steal at $69,000. What would that book be costing today, the value of it?
Several million.
I'm sure of that. Well, at the same time, the one night, down at the cottage, Henrietta was entertaining a few people, one of whom was the president of Harvard. And I was seated next to him. And of course, I was all of maybe 19. And he was very interested in what youth were thinking in college and blah, 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 you know. And I told this professor, or he was a doctor, I told him everything I knew in one evening. And I've oftentimes thought of that, what he must have thought. But looking back on it, I can see that he probably felt he was just inquiring what youth was thinking in that time.
When you get a chance to do that, though, you got to unload a little.
Yeah, well, I unloaded quite a lot that night.
But I can't see you hitchhiking. I mean, I don't know. What did you ride in? I mean,
I rode in everything.
How did you get rides in this thing? I mean,
Well, I had an idea that I always wore a white shirt and a tie.
Okay.
And I looked at least presentable. And so I had no in those days, hitchhiking was
pretty
common.
Yeah.
I think both you men did that in your youth too. Mm-hmm. It was a common way of getting away. And it didn't cost me anything. You know?
No, it was wonderful.
Yeah. It was a great experience.
There were certain risks involved in it.
Well,
but
I never
thought about it. You
yeah.
know, never.
But I had a great time. Of course, my mother was scared skinny all the time I was away. But
and so then you went back, you hitchhiked back after sitting with the president of Harvard. Now you're back on the road again, like Jack Kerouac saying, "Let's take me there."
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember Agnes Larson gave me $10 to go. And of course I never forgot it.
No.
She was a very able teacher.
And we reminded her of it every time the grades came out.
Yeah.
You still owed her $10.
Yeah. Well, I came back to St. Olaf that fall, and while I was there, of course, I sang in the St. Olaf Choir, which was a very prestigious musical organization at that time, and it was directed and founded by F. Melius Christiansen in 1912. It was really the first touring American choir, and they gained their first eminence when they sang in New York to critics, and critics had never heard the lavish praises, and from there on, the feel of the St. Olaf Choir.
It still plays well.
Still is. Yeah. And they've been touring. They were the first touring professional or non-professional choir.
Remember where you went? Did you tour then?
Well, we went from the last tour I was on we went to the West Coast. We came from Minneapolis, a 5-week tour.
By train.
By the Empire Builder.
Nothing
we went all along the way, and we sang in Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles and Pasadena and Salt Lake City and come back through Denver and Chicago. Then 2 performances in Chicago,
How did you afford this? I wonder how that was financed. That's not a cheap
No, well, of course,
tour.
we had sold out houses
Yeah.
in those days. I mean, it was a type of thing that Dr. Christensen was really the man that instituted the a cappella singing in America. And I had him as a teacher, too, I mean.
Well, the music is great.
Oh, yes, he
It's
was,
fun
he
to
was a
sing,
fine
fun
man.
to work on. It's
He was one of the
exciting.
greatest men I ever knew. And he had a personality in which you could, he would, if he would say, well, this is really white, and it was black, you'd say, you're absolutely
right, sir.
We believed it, anything, but he was quite a guy.
That worked
Yeah.
well. But you were a tenor or a bass?
I sang baritone,
Because I remember when you sang.
yeah.
I remember
The
singing.
choir made one of their only appearances in Hudson that year because there were two of us from Hudson.
Who was-
Donovan Thompson, whose father was the Reverend Oscar Thompson, and myself.
That's great.
Yes, and we sang in Lee Auditorium there into an overcrowded house. I mean, it was wonderful.
That's great.
Yeah.
I don't remember that, but
No,
that's
well,
great
that was in
anyway.
1940.
No, I was 5 years old. Then.
Yes, that's right.
Well, we got you through college. Is there
All
anything
right,
else you've got to talk about with college?
I think that's about that.
Okay.
But I came to Hudson and I had a job teaching in Mayville, North Dakota. And this was in the fall, and I was going out to Mayville. And my father said to me, well, son, you know, Mayville is in really the wilds of North Dakota, and they're 50 miles from the railroad. And you know, you can't come home every week, or you'd probably be lucky to get home at Christmas. And of course, on the salary that I was offered there, I think it was either $100 or $105 a month.
You missed one of my relatives. He was a doctor there.
Oh, well,
Maybe just
I'm
before
sorry
that.
to have missed him.
In the wild. But
I
that was.
came back, and then, well, and I took very much to heart because, well, not being able to get home and teaching for 105, and Clarence Ryder, who was the publisher of the Hudson Star Observer at the time, and an old family friend, said, well, we have an opening at the office. Would you like to try that? And I said, well, I suppose I could. And of course it would be, I would have to answer the phone and do the advertising, sweep out, and do the local news, cover meetings and all this and that. And it was really an all-inclusive job I had. And I think I started out at $12 a week, or was it 11? I forget which. But I was raised in 2 weeks till I got $15.
Now, when was this?
This was in 1940, right
40.
before the war. And so I've been there ever since. I start 64 years next
When did you
week.
start you started writing for them right away?
I wrote my first column along our street in October of 1940.
Yeah.
The boys were going off to war at that time. They'd been,
This is the
guards
National
had
Guard.
been nationalized and were going to Camp Beauregard in Louisiana, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so you
And of course, I didn't have a car. I had a bicycle. And I rode back and forth to home and at lunch. So I really came out quite well. And strangely enough, I did save money by working there.
I bet. And one of the things I forgot to ask you about,
Yes.
that I'm interested in, was your experience with polio. And that was
yes.
what is that about 19? We got to go back, guys. I'm sorry.
But that was 1931.
31.
I was the only person in St. Croix County that had polio. And of course, my parents were horrified. And Dr. Livingston, our local GP, was our doctor, and he came, and I was said, and I couldn't be taken to a hospital because the hospitals didn't know how it was
Contracted, whether it was.
how you got it. And so I had to stay home, and my mother was quarantined there, and she took care of me. And I was off for the whole first semester of school.
What did they do then? What did they suggest? What did she have to do to treat you?
My mother would use hot packs on my leg and my foot and on my back. And that seemed to put me, I was in a wheelchair to begin with, and I had to go back to school. So I got back, I lived right across from the school, so it
It's
wasn't
a
like
short trip.
a short trip. So that's the way. But strangely enough, this treatment of polio, my mother and I were at the St. Paul Union Depot. We were going down to Iowa some years later. And my mother ran into Sister Kenny, who founded the Kenny Institute for Polio in Minneapolis. And my mother told her exactly what she had done to nurse me and all there. And Sister Kenny said, you did absolutely the best thing that there ever was for it. And I pulled through, and I'm still here at 84.
So Dr. Livingston,
He had
by
the
the way,
right-
who delivered me.
Oh,
So,
really?
yes,
That's
yes.
interesting.
Just so not, but so he had good hands. We
Yes,
know
I
that.
guess so.
My
Yeah.
mother said
Yeah.
so. And so he pulled you through.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's really amazing that how early some of these folks knew instinctively almost what to do with some of
Yes.
these things that nobody.
You know,
knew
you were
about.
speaking of the polio then. Aunt Murphy was my teacher in grade school.
That's another one I forgot.
And
to
she
tell you.
was a very, very beloved teacher in Hudson. She taught here for, must be 40 or 50 years. And I came back to school. I hadn't been there the first semester. And the first thing she said, Willis, or she called me Billy. Of course, now you should tell your classmates here, you should tell them about your being sick and how it all happened. And so I related to them all. And you know, they all accepted it. I couldn't run and things like that, but I got along, and I wasn't a very good student, I guess, but I made it.
Hannah always spoke highly of Miss Murphy. Always spoke highly of you, though.
Well, she was a great, great woman. I always had a lot in my heart for her. She was.
One of the stories I remember about the 2nd Street, she lived on the corner of 2nd and maybe Orange.
It's right down here.
Right down,
Orange,
yeah. And I think it's an antique store now. But Mrs. Murphy was in the outhouse, and my Uncle Carl was shooting the BB gun, and unfortunately he shot the rat that ran into the outhouse at just the right time. So Mrs. Murphy came out very quickly.
Yes.
And but I was always welcome there too. That
Yes.
was she was a great teacher. She pounds you on the hand once in a while and reminds you that your dad was a much better student than you were.
Oh, well, I didn't have that.
I know, that's what I had. That.
They always said she had eyes in the back of her head.
Oh my goodness, she was a tall,
She
red-headed
was a big
woman.
headed, a big boned woman, and quite large.
Boy, but she was tough.
Well, she was
And
sweet.
had that
though.
sweet.
Yeah.
Then the tears would come.
Yeah.
So she'd remind
Yeah.
you of something.
Yeah.
And well, I got to get you back to. We got to get back on track again
Yes.
here. I'm sorry I forget those things, but you know, as you get older, it's hard to remember all
Yes,
these
it
things
is.
in order. So now we've got you at the newspaper, and the war has begun.
Well, I was with the newspaper for 12 years, and my boss came to me and said one day, he said, Willie, I'm going to sell the paper to Charlie Ward. And he said, I know that if, and I, of course, was concerned about my job, and I questioned Mr. Ryder about it, and he said, well, I think that if you can get along with Charlie Ward, you can get along with anybody, and how true it was. Mm-hmm. Well, the Wards, Charles and Yvette, were great, they were beneficent people. I mean, really, they were very generous. They had the great interest in putting a hospital in Hudson. And the second hospital, Hudson Memorial Hospital, was formed. The organization and a campaign for funds was doing. But now they were both concerned about it having acceptance in the community. So that is why they bought the paper, to put the hospital across. And they did.
And it
of
did.
course.
1953 it opened.
Yes, it opened in 1953. And,
Why don't you give us some background on Charlie Ward
Well-
and how he rose to prominence with Brown and Bigelow,
well,
that sort of
Charlie
thing?
Ward had been incarcerated in Kansas for a while, and his cellmate in Leavenworth was Mr. Herbert Bigelow. And Herbert Bigelow said, while they were incarcerated, when you get out, you come to St. Paul and I'll give you a job.
Now,
And
Bigelow was in
he was the
prison,
president of... and he was the-
president of Brown and Bigelow in St. Paul.
Yes.
But he was in prison for income
Tax evasion. Mhm. And so, come 1925, I believe Mr. Ward came to work at Brown and Bigelow. Well, Mr. Bigelow at the time was having some problems with his wife, I believe, or something. And he was living at his farm, Quality Park Farm, outside of Hudson.
Charlie Ward's farm.
What is now Charlie, but he had the whole acreage out there in a big home. And so he stayed, he and Mr. Bigelow would ride a great deal on weekends. They had beautiful horses. And this one particular time that I saw them, they had ridden into town. And I was with some other children, or we were about 8 or 9 years old. And this one little boy said to me, say, if you go up and call that man Charlie, he'll give you a silver dollar. Well, that was a good bait, so I went up and called him Silver Dollar, or called him Charlie Ward, and I got the silver dollar. And I promptly took them, we went up to Stonner's Candy Store, right across the street, about $1 worth of candy, which we all ate. But since that time, I've known Charlie for all these many years, and he was a terrific man. He was good news all the time. In our community, he was so generous with everything.
Now, there was a great mystery
Yeah.
about his taking over the company.
Well, there was, and
Yeah.
you know, this is interesting. I've always found it interesting. I would go out to the house with business for the Star Observer, and I would come sometimes after work, and it'd be maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock. I got out there, and Charlie would be in his bedroom.
Now, before you start this,
Yes.
Mr. Bigelow was the rumor was that Mr. Ward had him drowned or had
Yes, that's
killed
right.
him.
And so, well, anyway, this one particular evening, we went upstairs, and he was in bed, and he was reading. So we discussed business and things like that, and then I noticed on his dresser there were 2 photographs. One was a woman, one was a man. I said, Charlie, who are these people? He said, well, the woman is my mother. And he said, the man is Herbert Bigelow. And he said to me, you of course have heard that I murdered Mr. Bigelow, didn't you? And he said, by having him drown. I said, well, I've heard it. He said, do you think I did it? Well, I said, I don't really know, but if you say so, that's it. He said, I want to tell you one thing, he said. I have this on my dresser, and I look at this man's image every day of my life, and I have a conscience. I could not. I just couldn't do it.
Could not have been the person that killed him.
No, and I fully believe that.
I guess I do too.
Yeah.
But there's certainly a lot of stories.
He never, of course, Charlie always, his time in prison always was on his mind. He felt that he paid his debt to society, and I think he was given a bum rap by a lot of people, because he gave away more than he ever got on all of this.
If he did some bad things,
Well, he always said he wasn't an angel, and I think we all believe him. Yeah.
And now, how was he involved with? Do you remember how did he get involved in Charlie's Cafe?
Well, his wife, her first husband was Charlie Saunders of the Café Exceptional. They were married early on, and they had one daughter who is Charlene, and she's married now to Jimmy Niederlander in New York, who incidentally is an angel for Broadway productions.
Oh, really?
Yes, and she has homes in New York and in London and in California.
So that was Charlie Saunders. Charlie
yeah,
Saunders. Then
Charlie,
he married.
He married again, but Charlie Ward married the widow, or the grass widow of Yvette, or the grass widow of Charlie Saunders.
Okay.
You see. And they were married in 1940 out at the ranch in Arizona.
That's interesting.
February 29th, 1940.
Now, what was Charlie like to work for as a boss at the newspaper?
Well,
And what would be something you guys would do?
Well, she ran the business. She was supposedly the publisher. And of course, she never did a line of writing, and that wasn't her forte. She was a good administrator. She had good ideas, and she had some ideas that weren't quite so good. And one of them especially, she wanted us to publish national news. Well, I went to Charlie then, and I said, this is just impossible. People don't take the Hudson paper to read national news. And I told Charlie all this, and he said, oh, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. Sure enough, we never had any more national news.
One of the great stories that I know you know a lot about has to do with the one time, in my knowledge, that Hudson ever was on the front page of the New York Times.
Yes.
And that would be regarding a jewel theft by was she one of your classmates?
No, she wasn't. She was older than I was, and her name was
Kathleen
Nash Durand.
And she married this Mr. Captain Durand.
He was a colonel. Well, anyway, she was a graduate of Hudson schools, I think, in the early 1900s. And then she was a whack captain.
Now, what she did is she apparently was involved in the in heisting a lot of jewels out of one of the castles.
It was Kronberg Castle. It's not too far from Frankfurt.
Just after the war.
And she did all this in 1947, I think. Wasn't it?
46, I think.
46 or 47.
Yeah.
Well, just so that people know that following the U.S. occupation in Germany at the end of the war and shortly after the war, quite a number of German possessions, art, jewelry, and other things were removed from the country. And then we come up with this particular jewel heist that has the Hudson connection.
Well, I visited Kronberg after, in 1949 or 50. And I went to the Kronberg Castle. And Kathleen had told me, said, now when you go to Europe, she said, you stop and tell them, and they'll know me. And I said, I suppose.
But they will.
And so they had heard, she and her husband had heard. She was, it was not U.S., what was the?
They were in some sort of a governmental thing.
Yes, it was. It was a rest and recreation.
Yeah.
They turned the castle into that, and beneath that, these jewels were of the Countess of Hesse. They were there. They've been stored away and boarded up. They had been sealed in there.
And they escaped the Hitler regime entirely.
So they had them, but the American people that were in this castle for this
Occupation
of this
anyway.
Control.
And they had heard about this, and so they broke in, and there was a group of them with Kathleen Nash and her husband. They took all the jewels.
And where did these jewels come to?
Well, they were sent to her house, her sister's house here on North 3rd Street. And I'm probably one of the only people that saw these things. Mr. Ryder and I went up to see. The police said, well, come on, go with us.
Oh, this is after she's been...
They were back in Hudson, and this is after the war, and it was a long table, or several long tables like this, and all these jewels like you've never seen before in your whole life, were there. And plus, the bound letters of Queen Victoria to her daughter, who was the Countess of Hesse. And so, I mean, you could never get rid of those, but they were taken and all. I think they were returned, but the jewels never were returned in their entirety. There's been several books written on that, and of course that says that after the jewels, the military came up to get them in Hudson after this display and all, took them to Fort Sheridan, and half of them were gone by the time the inventory got to Fort Sheridan.
Don't you wonder what happened?
Yes, I do.
So the Hess jewelry is mostly gone. But you were notified. I mean, you must have. Weren't you the quoted person in the?
Well, I was quoted too. And, well, nobody was able to speak to Mrs. Lonergan, who was Kathleen Nash's sister, and I had been on the PTA with Mrs. Lonergan, so I knew her very well. And I was shouting outside her. I said, "Eileen, it's Willie Miller." And she said, go away, And so I don't want to talk to anybody. So we stayed there anyway, but nobody got to speak to her. But later, Mrs. Lonergan came down to the newspaper and said, well, we're going to cancel our subscription. You use this in the paper, and it's kind of besotted us.
Yes. Well, it was a difficult time.
It was very difficult.
Did she do some time then?
She did a year and a day in Alderson Prison in West Virginia.
Was she drink? I think a lot of her problem was alcohol.
Alcohol, it was over. She was used.
But
Many people
you
say
talked to her afterwards at some
Oh,
point.
yes, she did. She was a secretary to Charlie Ward in his office. Over there, she got a job after she came out
Did
of
she live
prison.
here then?
Yes, she lived here.
I can't remember her.
No. Well, I went to several parties with her.
Sure, you would.
She was a...
Was she wearing a lot of jewelry at the time?
Well, you know, it's a funny thing, speaking of the jewelry, at the junior prom of this, maybe 46 or 47, her daughter to the junior prom wore a stunning piece in heavy silver and chain and everything. It was quite spectacular. And people announced about it, and everybody thought it was fake. They thought it was custom
But that was the
jewelry.
real thing.
But it was the real thing from the Duchess of Hesse. Or
Oh,
Countess of
neat.
Hesse. Yeah.
Well, this put Hudson on the
It was
map, sort of
the
via
criminal-
the New
the
York,
criminally anyway.
yeah, infamously in the New York
Well,
Times.
the day the story broke in New York, I was alone at the office out there, and I couldn't leave the office. We had phone calls from every leading paper in America, I think, really. And well, of course, I didn't know too much about the whole thing anyway, but I knew Kathleen and Mr. Ryder was a publisher, and he wasn't around that morning.
So you answered the
I had
question.
to answer the phone, and it was one of the most exciting days of my life.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And they put her away, and then she came back, and she's been gone for.
She's been gone a number of years.
Some
She went
years.
out to Arizona, and she was the manager of the Arizona club there. She and her first husband.
I wonder if she had jewels. So that's
Well,
what I-
everyone wondered that too, but at the time she said, well, you know, when they came and confiscated all the jewels up at Lonergan's house, they even took some of my own possessions. I had diamond earrings that had been left me by my grandmother, and they were never found again.
No.
So,
Well, the secret is don't do the crime if
Yeah,
you can't
that's-
afford the time,
that's
because
right.
that's what happens. One of the things I want you to talk about was, I think your first book was, and the most important thing you've ever done in light of history, I think, was the old cemetery records.
oh yes.
And it always intrigued me of how you wrote that book and how you got the information for it. The old cemetery, the part we're talking about really is on the west side of Ninth Street.
Ninth Street.
And it presently is in rather poor condition. There's been a lot of damage there over the years, and many of the stones that were there when you were there in 1940.
The first burial, of course, at the old cemetery was in 1850. That was the first burial. Well, I did that. I've always been interested in genealogy, and so I documented these tombstones. All made, and I did this on a Sunday afternoon, generally every Sunday.
But now you had help with this?
Well, yes, and Nancy Kermott,
Okay.
Bud Kermott's sister, was home that summer, and she would make some sandwiches, and we would bicycle up to the cemetery, and I would do this very systematically, copying off the records, and I did that, and finally we published it then later, and it has been very popular. We sold out, I think, at
Every
least
time,
one edition.
yes.
Yeah.
And you know, in light of what's happened, it's become
Well,
it's the only record really of the. I
the
mean,
early
there
burials, yeah.
are records, but
And I would think at least 20% of the gravestones have disappeared since I was up and documented it. They've gone forever.
now I remember the last Civil War veteran was Anton Swanson,
Anton Swanson.
and I tried to check him out years ago and tried
That's a very interesting
Isn't
story.
it something? And this man, he came here in 1852 with his children, with his mother and father, and was enlisted in a Minnesota unit. And we could never find his name listed in the Minnesota record of soldiers. And it so happened this spring I was in Fort Snelling and I bought a book on Minnesota soldiers, and the first time I really looked at it myself. And here's Anton Swanson, our last Civil War veteran, buried in the northwest corner of that cemetery, and not well marked. And here he is enlisting, they've got his name as Anton Swanton. So when I asked for help, everybody looked for Anton Swanson at the top of the list. here he is at the bottom of the list, enlisting from Hudson, along with
Yeah.
4 or 5 other people. Eastman, there are several people that went at the same time. And this unit was was the 3rd Minnesota Light Artillery, and
It was a clerical
it
error.
was a clerical
obviously.
error. So here he is, with this winsy little man who was a neighbor of mine in East Hudson, and was taken.
He was the last Civil War veteran. And of course, he would always go to the army where they had the.
There's a good story about him. You got to tell
I
it.
don't know if I can tell.
Yes,
that.
you
No, I
can.
don't know. But anyway, this was years ago, and this Dr. Livingston, by this time, Mr. Swanson, this was in the late
late
20s.
30s, or well, that's been
20s.
20s. What's this?
Oh yes, and
Because he lived in 1942.
yeah, and but he was really out of commission for a long time. Well, this one, he was kind of old and quite wiggly, you know, and they would march up to the, sit on the podium.
At Memorial Day.
On Memorial Day, and Marion Crary would sing, and the preacher would give the address and all, and Dr. Livingston had to accompany poor Mr. Swanson and help him up the steps and take him down. And of course, Mr. Swanson was very deaf, and he said, finally he said, Doc, Dr. Livingston, I gotta urinate. He didn't use that word,
But that's all right.
it broke up the Memorial Day. People laughed all until the end of the situation.
I often thought if he was a Norwegian, of course.
Yes.
And if he'd have been English, I thought he would have a wonderful place in the community. He lived here
Yes.
all his life,
He never got the
worked for the
due.
shop. No.
No.
And
reverence.
well, in the old papers, you know, in the early times, they would say they would name the people who died of cholera in 1852 or something, and then they'd always say at the bottom of the list, and a couple of Norwegian kids,
Yeah.
you know,
That's
died.
the way
And
it
that
was
was the way
done.
it was listed, unfortunately. And then while we're on this, as long as we've broken all the bounds of propriety here, one of the stories that I remember as a kid was a place that was always a mystery spot in Hudson to go to, and that was what we called Nigger Coulee.
Oh, yes.
And it's not a propriety. That's not the right way to say it, but that's what they called it. So I guess historically we could say that.
Well,
but how did what? Now you did some.
Well, I did a story on that once, and I used the word, the N word, and of course you wouldn't do it in today's word. It was an entirely different time frame, and that all has passed. You just wouldn't. I mean, you wouldn't do that anymore. But as a
Where was this? No.
It was in North Hudson. It was up beyond Star Woods, up in there. And another buddy of mine, it could have been Wayne Bowles. I've kind of forgotten. This was over 70 years ago, so it's I do forget. But I think we rode up there on our bicycles, and we saw this. It was the remains of an old cabin, and all the timbers had rotted and fallen into the pit. And this was there when I was there in the late 1920s. And the story of it is that he was a black man. He was on a steamboat that came up the river. He contracted either smallpox or measles or whatever, and he was put off the boat. And he went to this cabin, and that was his cabin. And he lived there for quite some time. And he was a character around town, and they always designated that area as Nigger Coulee. Yeah,
and that's what was in my
that's
in my era
the name
too.
of it, yeah.
And of course that was pretty common. Many of these people that's who did the work on the steamboats.
Oh yes.
Steamers as they came up and down the river, and there were a lot of people like that. Just this year, we were looking at Nauvoo, Illinois, for Silas Snell and the Page family, and I know you've got some stories about the Page family that maybe we could talk about.
Yeah. Well, John Page came here in 1846, and he was a lumberman. And when he came on the ship, a man by Silas Snell, or called that, he told John Page, he said, "Well, if I die in this vicinity, can you bury me on that high promontory, which is now we've called Liberty Hill?" And by chance, the man did die there, and John Page had to take a crew of men and cut their way up and take the body, and he's buried there on the high promontory and there's just a simple marker. It said Silas Snell is buried here in 1847. So he was the first burial in this.
Well, this
area.
summer my wife and I went to Nauvoo. And we thought maybe, because he came out of that, John Page came out of that
Yeah,
community.
he
He was
did.
called a Mormon and came out of that community. But I learned some things when I was down there. One of them was that the Nauvoo grew so fast when they got to Illinois from Missouri. Nauvoo grew so fast that they needed wood for houses. And so the Indian territories up here had been ceded from the natives to the white community in 1837. By 1840, they had done the legal work with meets and bounds and open to logging. And apparently, Captain Page was head of a logging crew
He was.
that went up the river and cut logs and sent them down to build much of Nauvoo at that time.
That's right.
And one of the things that I learned down there was that there is another Snell down there by the name of Solomon Snell, who was apparently related to this
Really?
man.
Really?
And when you look at the promontory where the Mormon church has built their new white church overlooking the Mississippi, it's a gigantic building, and I can see the likeness that Mr. Snell would have looked up at the top of our hill out here and said, I think it reminded him of home.
It probably did.
Yeah, it's my understanding that maybe he was dying at the time rather than
it could have been.
And did pass, and this was where he was laid. And there's an amazing similarity to the view.
Yeah.
The more
Speaking of John Page, the only piece of furniture that I know of John Page's is in Hudson. It's at the Octagon House. I met John Page's daughter, who was Eliza Page, and
she was considered the first
was
white woman.
She was the first white woman born
Abigail.
in Hudson.
Abigail
Page.
was the place
Bailey.
named after him.
Yeah, and she was born on April 15th, 1847. And that's the day that the first steamer docked in Hudson.
On her birth.
Yeah, on her birth. And, well, anyway, the furniture, my mother knew her, and Mrs. Page at that time was blind. And so we went, and she lived on a little house on 3rd Street, and my mother went to see her, and she wanted to sell a trundle bed, a little trundle bed, a single bed, and it was a spool bed. And it was in kind of rough shape, and I think my mother paid maybe $3 for it. Well, and we took it home, and it was all, we've had it...
Now this is Mrs. Bailey now, Mrs. Page, Abigail
Page
Bailey.
And she, my mother bought this and took it home, and we used it in our house for many years. And I gave it quite recently, well, 15 years ago, to the Octagon House. I had it all refinished, and it's interesting, there's an exact replica, duplicate of that piece of furniture in Sibley House in Minneapolis.
Huh. That's great. I think there's Baileys. I think I've come upon them in my own genealogy, so I think I must have a shirt tail in there someplace, but I've forgotten how it works. But she, of course, there were a lot of women born here in Hudson before 1847.
Oh, yes.
And the community.
But she was the first one that...
When another one of the famous people, infamous, or I guess not famous people, but one that always intrigued us was a guy by the name of Yamkowski.
Oh, Yamkowski.
Do you remember him?
Well, I've heard tell about him like...
Old Bonnie.
Old Bonnie.
Yeah.
And they called him Bonnie. He had, supposedly, he had served with the Napoleon's armor at Waterloo. And so they always called him Boney. And he lived here, and I don't suppose he spoke English. I really don't think so.
No, I got it.
But locating him, he died in 68, incidentally.
It's 1868.
1868.
You know, I saw him fishing down in the river,
Yeah.
and everybody said there's old
They
Bonnie.
all knew old Boney.
Yeah.
And he was quite a character in Hudson. He lived with his daughter, Mrs. Bruce. And he's buried, we think he would probably be buried down in the French cemetery at 1st and St. Croix Street.
Which is?
Because that was a French settlement. And here, back in the first paper in Hudson, that was published in 1850, carried a column written in French.
Actually,
Yeah.
you're right, absolutely
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
it was a half of the front page was French and half.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't read it. I know
No, I
that.
couldn't. Well, But old Boney, we've always wondered if this was really the truth that he had. In the
He said he was
census of
107
18...
years old or something, he
Yes,
said in the
well,
paper.
there's this, I question, but we can't find any documentation of him. He wasn't in the census of 1850. There's only one thing that there was a family by the name of Andrews, and he was the only man that was Polish. Of course,
Called him
Yam,
Andrews.
yeah, Yam,
I've forgotten his first name now.
Yam,
Shoot, I can't remember.
I can't remember. But anyway.
But Yamkowski.
But we've never been able to track him down, but he was a here, and so
It mentioned regularly in the paper.
in the census, I think the census taker made an error some way, and they've misstated or wrote down the wrong man or the something, and they got the wrong name attached to
Now
this.
that early cemetery was on about where I think there was
The NSP used to have a
NSP building on it,
yeah,
by the railroad tracks.
yeah, that's right.
And,
At the mouth of the Willow River
yeah,
at that time.
and that was the church. Would have been a Catholic cemetery.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe where a lot of the
Early,
early settlers
yeah.
that weren't buried on the Catholics were buried separately. In
Yeah,
many
they
cases.
were, probably so.
While we're talking about early times, census records and early newspapers, maybe you should tell us about your index.
All the index.
How you got started
All
on this,
right.
what you've done,
All
what
right.
you've covered, and the stage it's at today.
The Hudson area biographical index, I started in 1940. I read all the papers, and I indexed the deaths and marriages. I started that way. I learned that when I was working at the Norwegian American Historical Society. They had a similar program, and I just copied it for Hudson. Well, I had a small filing case of 6 drawers of 4 by 6. That would probably hold 30,000 entries. I think that'll last quite a while. But since then, it's grown to much greater proportions. Now we have some 200,000 entries for people that have had some connection with Hudson.
Mentioned in the Hudson
In the
papers.
Hudson paper, they would be there.
Now, how far back have you gone?
Well,
From-
I've done it all from 1890 to the present.
So there's still some work left for it.
Oh yes, there's something someone else can do. But
Now-
we are getting now. It is being put on computer by a group headed by Marty O'Connell and Nancy. What's Nancy's?
Why did you say that?
Is it funny? She's just.
Yeah, it's gone now.
Well, we have
she's
over
right.
200,000 entries.
Yes,
Taken from any Hudson newspaper.
from the Hudson. Well, it's
It'd be
taken. It's most any other source.
Did
I
you
can-
do the True Republican? No, this is the Star
No, I
Times, the
haven't.
Star-
It's
Star
all
Observer.
just the Star and Times.
Okay.
But you know, in interest, there's one of our great gifts to the community over the years has been that we have a history room in the public library
Yeah.
here with a copier, and we have all the newspapers, True Republican. I think every newspaper ever published here from 1850, including that
Yes.
French paper that we talked
Yeah.
about, and they're all on
microfilm.
microfilm, and they have a reader and a copier in the library. So,
Hawkinson is.
Hawkinson, thank you very much.
Well, give us an example. Who would use this? Who would call
Well,
you? What
it's-
would a
it's-
typical question
It's
be?
surprising. It's in the past few years. It's just been a race to get there. It seems because I think a day hardly ever passes that I don't have somebody come in to inquire about it, or come and look at the records, or spend the morning there checking them, because there are every family that's had anything to do with Hudson is really mentioned there.
Yep. And it's all
It's all
indexed, and so you can find the paper,
and
go to the
everything.
library and find the right
Paper.
copy of it.
Our papers now can't be used. They're too brittle on the older papers, but they're all on microfilm at Hudson Library and at the Area Research Center in River
yeah.
Falls.
Have you ever heard of anyone else that has done a project like this, like yours?
Well, I picked it up in Northfield, and that's the only place I've ever seen it. One lady came in one day and she said, "Well, don't all newspapers have this?" And I don't think I think we're the only one in Wisconsin that probably does.
Well, you know, we tried to go back further and index.
Yeah.
It's not an easy job.
Oh, no.
And you have to know the local names because some of the names, the national news we didn't index.
No.
Any national,
Yeah.
you don't see Mr. General Eisenhower's name in there or mentioned of this
No.
that I remember.
No.
These are local people.
These are all local
And
people.
you had
They
to
have-
know this.
It has to be a local,
Yeah,
there has to be a Hudson connection to it.
yeah, yeah. It's just fascinating. I mean, I've used it 100 times.
Oh, and so many people
yeah.
have, yeah.
And I know they do. And I know some great stories of people that have come here.
There's one lady that came in and she had a little razor with her. And I had to leave the room and go upstairs, came back and she was snipping out pieces of the file newspaper.
Then, by the way, you do have the newspapers
Oh, yes,
in
they-
the main there, but
Yeah.
they really are quite
Well, anyway,
hard.
this is when you could consult them. And I said, well, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm just taking this because you'll have no use for them.
No, of course not.
Well, she was giving her walking papers. Yeah.
It's goodbye. But I know a lot of folks that come there. I've talked to people
yeah.
that have used that, and it's more than likely, it's going to be thought of in the future as maybe your greatest gift and contribution.
Really, I do think it's really quite a thing.
Well, now it's been copied, right?
Oh, well, they're
being
they're putting it on
being
microfilm.
digital.
Putting on
now,
microfilm.
But they're
On the-
being on
digital.
computer.
On-
It's going to
on
probably
computer.
be a CD-ROM
Okay.
or something.
Yeah.
But you still have all the original
Yes, we have.
cards in your office
Yeah,
right now.
right.
And still working on that
Yeah.
format, aren't you?
I do it once a week. It takes maybe 2 or 3 hours a week to make the entries into the. And just with this index, there are other sources too. I've listed all the graduates of Hudson High School. You know.
Willis, we were talking about your time at the newspaper back in the 50s and working for Charlie and Yvette Ward, and give us an idea of what that might be like, or some interesting things that happened.
Did
what the
Charlie,
newspaper
did Charlie ever
business
stop
was
in and visit with you?
Oh yes, it was. I recall this one time particularly. He would give me a call and said, "What are you doing?" Well, I said, "I'm at the office." He said, "Lock the damn door." You know,
Would this be Saturdays? by any chance?
Saturday,
Okay.
and he said, "I'll be down." And he liked to go to the local watering places and have a drink and find out what was going in the community. Here was a man that had a fabulous fortune, and he was good news for any paper, any place Charlie went, he was news. So we would go up to one of the bars, and the habitués that were there were drinking nickel beers, automatically changed to top shelf whiskey.
Of course they did. I'm buying her own. I'm buying
and
her
he'd
own.
say,
right?
"You'll have to put $50 on the
Yeah, yeah.
till around the bar."
That would hardly even get
And
to the
he would-
first two people.
Yes,
by
and
the
that's
time.
what he'd do this quite on occasion. He enjoyed knowing what was going on in the local community.
A hard man to work for.
They were, well, yes, I suppose. It was 6 years that I wouldn't trade for anything, but I could never go through it again.
No.
Because you became, well, they dictated the way they wanted it, and if you weren't a friend, they thought you were an enemy. They had that idea of it.
Well, that was kind of, I was an outsider
Yeah.
in this, but I always felt that they were difficult people to deal with, and yet I know that there was some great heart and love in those folks.
Oh, yes, they were,
remember
and
the
they were
family
very
well?
generous. The first time I remember with him, I had accumulated $500 in my check account, and I talked to Charlie, and I said, maybe I should invest this. I should buy some stock. He said, well, that's a good idea. How much have you, Willis? Well, I said, I have $500. He said, $500? That's nothing. I'll loan you $5,000, and you'll have to pay 1% interest. He said, well, do you want to buy some Brown & Bigelow stock? And you can pay it just out of the dividends and pay him back. And I did. And I finally paid him up. And he said, you know, Willie, I always liked you because you never asked me for anything. I've always given it to you.
That's great.
And when I would go on a trip, or sometimes he'd always send his chauffeur in, and frequently there'd be $200 or $300 or $400 in this envelope for me, so I'd have spending money.
I know that he had great largesse for all the
Yes,
many of the folks
and
that
when I would go to the ranch, I mean, they have a ranch in Arizona, and it's Rancho Roca Roja, and
which means
Red Rock,
okay,
the ranch Red Rock.
Red Rock Ranch.
Yeah, that's,
yeah.
but that's what they call it there. And he said, you get on the train and you come down to Chicago and take the super chief, and they'll stop at Flag for you to get off. And they did. Not on their regular
in the middle
run.
of the desert.
Yeah. And so, and their plane would be there to take me to the ranch, 100 miles south of it.
Now, he was well connected. He knew governors
Oh,
and presidents.
governors,
and-
yes.
I mean, this was, he had some national connection.
Oh, yes.
Besides being a tremendously successful local St. Paul
Oh, yes.
businessman.
Well, on his, he gave President Roosevelt a model of a Russian ship, all done in silver, and he gave that, and it was, I don't know how, but he was at the White House a number of times during the Roosevelt administration, and later, this beautiful model was about that long, you know, and it had lights in it, and little doors would open, but it's made of solid silver, you know.
Huh.
And it was by a famous Russian.
Well, what, you know, I didn't know they could take presents.
Well, they did because it was at Hyde Park. I visited
was.
out there, and later I saw
I think
it
we
there.
should start an investigation.
And so, well, I wrote to them, and I used it in my column that they had this, and they said they still had it on their catalog, but it had been taken by one of the Roosevelt boys after FDR's death, and had taken it from Hyde Park into his own, and they don't know what happened after that.
It's like the defense budget, just
Yeah,
spending.
it's the same thing, isn't it?
You bought the paper then from the
Yes,
Charlie.
and well, Charlie said to me, "Well, I'll bankroll you. You know that."
Who would have gotten it if it wasn't you?
Well, I don't know. There were other people fishing for it.
I'm
It was
sure
a good
there
piece of property, and he said, "I'll bankroll it for you." And I said, "No, I think I'm going to do it my own way, you know." But luckily, it worked out that way because I would have. He died the year after this, and then it had been a different proposition
You'd have
with
had to pay
Mrs.
back
Ward
the estate.
and the estate and all. And so I formed a small corporation, and we went on from there, which I was the majority stockholder of the business. And so I became president and treasurer of the company.
Well, your background in ownership was not strong, though.
No, of course not. But I learned a great deal. They would come out and do the wards in their time came and they came out monthly and checked the books and that type of thing.
Yeah. Really
And
good.
it was I learned a great deal from them.
Yeah.
They were smart people, and they knew how to entertain.
Oh, they did.
Oh, their parties.
There was a guy one time when I remember you telling the story about having some little boy come to your door because
Oh.
there were papers blowing around.
Oh yes, well that's another story.
I'd like to hear that.
This is connected to the Historical Society. This was must be 15, 18, 20 years ago at least. It was a Saturday.
It was
after-
early 1970.
Yeah, I think about 30 years.
Time flies. Isn't it time flies?
It's hard to believe. But this little kid came and he had a big box with him. And he said, "You buy old stuff." And I said, "Well, yes, I suppose. I collect stamps." They said, "Oh, there are a lot of stamps in this and all." And I said, "Well, bring it inside." And so he came in. I looked at it immediately. And I noticed they were the personal papers of Sam Campbell, the Indian agent at La Pointe, which is now Bayfield. And I went through them, and I said, "Well, what do you want for this?" "Oh, I don't care." And I said, "If I give you $5, would that be enough?" "Oh, that'd be great." So he left the box. And I said, "Where'd you get these?" He said, "Well, I got them. They're tearing down this old house there, and they're putting the stuff in
And
the
that
dumpster."
was the Campbell house.
In the Campbell house, where the Yenches lived.
That's right.
Because Sam Campbell had built that house in 1900, and then Mrs. Yench used it later, his daughter. And I said, "Well, I'll go down and look tomorrow morning to myself." And the next morning I got up at 4 o'clock and went down to the Yench house, and they were raising it. They were tearing it down, putting stuff in the dumpsters. And all scattered over the lawn and under the porch were additional papers. And I rescued them all and they're there at the Area Research Center in River Falls. And according to what I hear, that's one of the best-known collection of papers they have for this area.
Yes, it is.
And for the
For the
Indian
native-
and
for
the
the,
Indian.
yeah,
Indian
banana,
yeah.
for the Ojibwe people.
Yeah.
And there are some. I took the time to copy those papers.
Yeah.
30 years
Oh, they're
later,
wonderful,
and
aren't they?
they're tremendous. They solved all kinds of problems and political problems. I went into Mr. Campbell with a major. He was a Civil War veteran,
Right.
and I went in with him thinking he was kind of a typical Indian agent. But I realized after typical meeting, quite unconcerned about his charges. But he was very concerned about them, and if you
He
can
was
take him
concerned about
in his era,
Yeah. For his era,
for
yes.
his time, there are letters from some of the students, some of the youngsters in school to him, just heart-wrenching letters, and he acted on these. And he got pillared by the La Follette administration, who didn't like him because he was quite successful.
Yeah.
And they found his niche in his armor, and that was that because the federal government was so slow to pay the
Indians.
natives off for their land, he would take the money and put it in a side account and pay them so that they could have their property, their money. That's how they were living. The natives to have their money and to go on with it. And he kept very close records, most of which are in those papers that you had. And he had a wonderful heart for it, but they used it as saying he was stealing the money from them.
Well, that's what they said.
But it's not true.
He was at Appomattox in 1865 at the end of the Civil War.
Yes, he was.
And he was with Lincoln and General Robert E. Lee.
An interesting character.
Yes, he was. He just lived down the street from you here.
And a friend of Spooner's who was built
Well,
this up.
Spooner got his appointment to Washington. And in the papers, of course, there are letters from President McKinley, too.
Yes, there are.
were some. Mhm.
And it's amazing how the political parties sort of were. I mean, I think we're still uncomfortable about how how the payments are made to various people. I think there's a lot of discomfort with it. And apparently we discovered there's a lot of money missing from various accounts. But there was a lot of shuffling between the two parties in the La Follette era when he beat out Spooner.
Yeah.
And so anyway, Major Campbell was a fascinating guy who lived here, and as a matter of fact, they sent a lot of the kids down from up there to work. Some of the Indian kids from the Indian school to work, thinking they would get some education and how to deal with life. I'm not sure. Again, well intended. I'm not sure it was the right thing to do, but it was something to do.
Ideas, it's a lot different
It
today.
has changed. Well, there's some folks around here that I know that you knew. One of the guys I wanted to ask you about was Oswald Solheim.
Oswald Solheim.
Oswald wrote a book
Yes.
that you helped put together.
Oh, yes,
One of the great books beyond your own.
Yes, well, he was.
Tell me about Oswald.
Well, anyway, Oswald was a cartoonist besides, and he'd have chalk talks, and one time I had approached him some years ago to have some reminiscences. So he would do these on a weekly basis, which I ran in the newspaper as a weekly story. And then after the whole thing was done, I incorporated them into a small book. And so I forget what the name of it was.
Oh my
I don't
goodness!
know.
And it's a book that's disappeared
Yes.
from my library.
Well, anyway, it's as scarce as hen's teeth
Yes.
now because
Let's do it again.
and it was very, very popular. People loved.
Yeah. He had a great story, and his son.
Well,
I remember his son.
The Solheims were some of the first people we knew when we came to Hudson when I was a young boy, and we would go to their home, and he was.
What was Russell? Your vintage?
Russell was a little older than I was, and so I knew him quite well. And in the World War II, of course, he went in the army, and he was killed in Normandy. And in 1949, when I was on my trip to Europe, that I made by singing at funerals, and things like that.
See, we're back to music again.
And so I said, well, I'll go and visit his grave. They wanted me to do that, and I did it. It was quite a feat for me to get out there to Normandy from Paris and all, and I went and I brought home a piece of soil or a little sack of soil. I took it to the Solheims, and they both wept. It was really very emotional.
They put this together.
Yes, and later Russell was returned to the United States, and I sang at his funeral.
You did.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what you sang. We could duplicate it here.
Yes, we could.
But I don't want that. Well, that book was one of the is really.
We had that
prize.
sold out very. It was a small run,
Yeah.
maybe 500 copies at the most. And I know we did have a order from the Royal Library in Oslo, Norway. They wanted a copy. They bought a copy.
I'll be darned. So we're famous.
Solheim is a good name.
Yes, it is.
That means Sun Hill,
Sun
you know, or Sun. Yes.
Yeah, I think it is. Anyway. And think of some of the folks that you've met. I mean, I was just thinking of the Phipps family.
Well, the Phippses, of course.
Hughes is the.
Well, the Octagon House was the home of the Phipps, or of the right across from the Phipps house.
Okay.
The Octagon House was, of course, John Shaw, Moffat.
Moffat, yeah.
And he built that house in 1855. Of course, it was just more or less of a dirt road and an Indian trail up the road here. And across, this was when it was built in 55. The Phipps house, the mansion, now is a bed and breakfast. And that house was built in 1885. Phipps had come here as an official of the West Wisconsin Railroad. And he was an investor, and he was, in fact, he was, later he became a land agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And he was a very wealthy man, and he made a great fortune. The Phipps Foundation, of course, was founded by his son with money that had accumulated from that. And Mrs. Phipps, old Mrs. Phipps, and the young Mrs. Phipps were both my Sunday school teachers at the Presbyterian Church.
See, my great-grandfather was the caretaker.
Yeah, that's right.
At their house.
Yeah.
Danish immigrants couldn't
Yes.
rise too far too quickly. But
Well, but Mr. Phipps was a very fine man. He was a small man, Richard. You'll be happy to know that.
that's, well, we'll talk about size.
Yes, that's right.
Diminutive people are very important.
And they were, of course, they had six. I think they had 6 children, and Stephen was the only Phipps that survived.
Now, was that the family that had money in South Africa?
No, that was the Lilies.
Oh,
the
it's
next
okay.
door.
Well, let's talk. See, I get my 3rd Street families mixed
Well,
up.
that is the house right next to, right north from Stephen's house
Okay.
there, and that is the John C. Spooner house. John C. Spooner was a United States Senator in the 90s and in the early years of this century.
1900s, yeah.
And he built that house in 77, and he lived there.
He was an attorney.
And it was later occupied by Gwen and Arthur Lilly. Arthur Lilly, of course, had gone to India when he was 18 years old to work for his uncle, Lord McRobert, who was the founder and owner of the British India Corporation in Kanpur, India. It's interesting, I was in Calcutta this particular time, and I went to Rotary meeting, and they always have an Indian take care of the visitors, and I was a visitor, and this man was a man from Calcutta that was a businessman there. So he asked why I went to India. I said, well, I'd heard so much about it by some friends of mine in St. Paul, and he said, yes, and what were they doing, and had they had any associations with India? So, oh, yes. And he said to me, it wouldn't be Arthur Lilly, would it? And it was Arthur Lilly. Mrs. Lilly was from South Africa, and as a youngster, as a youth, her brother and an Indian were tennis people, and the Indian that played tennis with her brother was Mahatma Gandhi.
Oh, be darned.
Yeah.
And how famous you are, I was talking to somebody about a week ago, and I wrote it down, but I forgot who I was talking to.
Oh, yeah.
And they said they'd been in Tehran, and talking to somebody in the community, and they said they're from Hudson.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we remembered Willis Miller from Hudson, so no matter where you go, your name never opened up a MasterCard charge, but it certainly would draw attention.
Well, I've been lucky. I've had a lot of wonderful travels throughout the world.
One of my favorite pictures of you is you on an F-80 Shooting Star. Were you really piloting that, or was that?
No, I wasn't. I was invited by the Marine Corps to go out to California, to go to the Marine base there, to write a story about how good the Marine Corps is, which it was. And I went out there. They flew us, a group of editors from this naval district. We were out there for a week. and at El Toro. And we were wined and dined.
So picture you all these years, I thought you were piloting that thing. It's a
I
fake.
thought-
Okay.
And that was the first time I'd ever been in a jet, I believe.
Yeah, it was
And the pilot, before we went up, he said, well, now, of course, if we should run into some difficulty, you know, you'll have to unbutton this and then on your legs and unbutton those and snap this off, and then you have to jump out the plane. Well, I said, I don't think I can do that. I think I'll have to go down with it. Because
With your talents, you could have flown it in. I know that. It would have been fun.
oh, that was funny.
Well, besides John Spooner, who was one of our famous politicians from
Yes.
Hudson, we also have James A. Freer. Did you know him?
Oh yes, he was a friend of my father's, and he had never lost an election. He was city attorney here, and then he became Secretary of State, and then he served 30 years in Congress. Never lost an election.
That's Wisconsin Secretary.
Yes, Secretary of State. Well, after he died, his wife remained in Washington. And I was in Washington one time, and I called her, and I said, I'd like to have an interview. And she said, well, you come out to the Shoreham. And I went out there, and I had a delightful interview with her, which I used in my column along our
The
street.
Shoreham being the famous hotel.
Yeah, she was a very delightful woman, and they had lived here many, many years. Yeah.
Did you keep copies of Along Our Street with Willie? This was the famous. I remember when it changed from a bicycle to a Jeep. So
That's right, and that
There
was
was
Charlie Ward's Jeep.
that was a logo that was on the front of the column every
Yeah.
week. And
Yeah, it was. Well, I wrote Along Our Street for 40 years, and it was a feature in our paper every week.
it had you on a bicycle. And,
Yeah.
then
The only time I ever missed was when I would have guest columnists would fill in when I was.
but they were
away.
not nearly as good.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
I would say that.
But
Well, tell us about just running the newspaper after you bought it in 1958 from Charlie Ward.
well,
Who did you have working? I can't remember.
oh well, there was Ted Peterson, Mr. Clare was the old printer, and then of course we took on new people, Walker Isaacson and Dick Jordahl, and of course Kay Johnson is still there, and Mrs. Johnson still writes a column, and she just turned 93 July 3rd.
So there's hope for you.
Yes, I
to
guess so.
Continue on with.
I did the column Historic Hudson. Well, I thought after I gave up Along Our Street I should do something, and I said I'll write a column on Hudson. I'll do it for a year, so I'll get tired of it. But I didn't. I kept on for 17 years and
You still
wrote
have the pictures.
700 columns in the
Yeah,
interim.
yeah, it's really amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. Tell me about Judge Arnquist. Does that name ring a bell?
Yes, Judge Arnquist was a county judge here for more than 30 years. He was a Swedish immigrant that came from Sweden, of course, and they lived up in the other side of New Richmond. And he came and he went to school in River Falls for their short terms, and he acquired a law degree or a law education, and then he was elected county, and you just couldn't beat Judge Arnquist. He was a very popular. Of course, he knew all the immigrants and all the Scandinavians, and his wife was a native Hudson woman, and they were both musicians, and they both were good singers, and Mrs. Arnquist, gave voice lessons, and